think and for me as a parliamentarian, when I was a parliamentarian, I always felt that the lens that I wanted to use on the issue of Palestinian statehood and rights was to focus on the Canadian government. I always support international solidarity work, but I always felt that the most useful thing I could do was to apply pressure here at home. We've all gone to the Global Affairs website. We can see what Canada's historical positions have been, which, by the way, did not change during that dark decade. They were always on the books. Yeah. The UN resolutions opposed to the settlements, various, I can't remember them all, but I mean, it's still there. I went and checked, right? But of course the practice changed. So to me, it was always about engaging and putting pressure in our Canadian context, not only on the government. I should actually rephrase that. It's really on Parliament, because of course Parliament is made up not only of the government, but of the opposition, and it might be the official opposition and the other parties. So it's the whole thing. How do we do that? Well, I mean, obviously campaigns, public campaigns, and some of you were talking about that this morning, and it was very interesting to hear where you think you've been successful and where you see some of the challenges. But the one I want to focus on, and because I talked to Mariana and we agreed that this might be interesting, is the idea of lobbying. Now, in listening to what you were saying this morning and your report backs, I heard petition campaigns, I heard that there were meetings, but I didn't hear much about lobbying. Now, to some people, it's rather scary, like, oh. Or actually, no, a number of people have even come up to me and said, yeah, I've gone to lobby, I've gone to talk to my MP, or even a couple of MPs. Okay, what I'm talking about is organized lobbying. It's somewhat different. There have been some groups over the years. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, UNJPPI, has done some lobbying over the years on Parliament Hill. The Canadian Arab Federation has done some lobbying, not so much recently. They used to be a voice, but then during the Harper years, they kind of got shut down, and I think felt totally intimidated. They had their money taken away. There's all kinds of accusations thrown at them, and I think they felt so unwelcome on Parliament Hill that they just kind of shut it down for a while. And I'm still in contact with some of those folks, and I'm always encouraging them about how can we re-energize and get people going again. Independent Jewish Voices has done some lobbying, so there is some going on. But I've always felt that it's not organized enough, and it's not united enough. And I can say that because I'm someone who got lobbied several times every week by, whether it was the concrete manufacturers of Canada. I learned a lot about concrete, whether it was public transit, whether it was the insurance companies, you name it, I got lobbied. All MPs do. And some of these lobbies, as we know, are incredibly powerful. They have paid lobbyists on the Hill. For example, Justin Trudeau and his government had met with a pharmaceutical lobbyist over 750 times. You want to know why we don't have pharmacare in this country? The power of those lobbyists. I could name others too. I'm talking about community lobbying, right? The voice of the community. I'm not talking about corporate or private interest lobbying. So organized lobbying. Often when I was lobbied, people would come with a huge amount of material, and they would kind of dump it on you, and they would assume that I knew everything that they'd been working on for the last 20 years. And they would just sort of like throw it on the desk, and they would, talk a mile in a minute for 15, 20 minutes, and I'd say, thank you very much, very interesting. And often they would leave, and I would think, you know, it's so funny. They never actually asked me to do anything. So weird. And I often wanted to kind of reach across the table and say, you know what, you're doing it all wrong. Like, you got to figure out what you want, and you got to ask me to do something, you know, at least try. So lobbying is actually something that I think is incredibly doable. And just listening to what the United Church of Christ, what you guys did with your video and how you kind of got out there, to me, what is the amazing thing is that when we sit down and strategize and we plan a plan, it is so doable. And this is what most people never realized about lobbying. You know, there were some good groups, like Students for a Sensible Drug Policy. I used to help them with lobbying workshops to teach them how to do lobbying. So about 50 of them would head up to the Hill. They would go and see a whole bunch of MPs, including conservative MPs, and then they would debrief afterwards and sort of figure out what they'd learned and what they had to fill up. Beautiful little exercise. Take a day. They, you know, would plan it in advance. It was so doable. This was students. I don't know if they still do it. But they began to change the discourse on the criminalization of people who use drugs, illegal drugs. And they did it because they were speaking in their name. That's what they called it, not in our name, something like that. It was about their experience. So designing a lobby is about, you know, the notion of lobbying 338 MPs is very daunting. Like, you'd have to have a huge organization to do that. One of the few organizations that managed to do that was the Canadian Labour Congress, when they were lobbying to get through. So it wasn't actually against anything. They were lobbying to get through an anti-scab legislation. So this is federal law whereby if there's a strike and the employer tries to break the strike, there would be federal legislation saying that you can't bring in scabs to break the strike, okay? It was a big issue, and the CLC did a very good job of lobbying on that. They had hundreds of people on the Hill. They had, you know, workshops to train people how to do the lobbying. Now, they had resources to do that. So that's sort of the high end. We're not talking about the high end. We're talking about the regular doable end, the more practical end. And so part of lobbying is figuring out who you want to lobby. So if it's not 338 MPs from all parties, who is it? Well, the first thing would be to sit down and strategize a bit and say, well, who are the key players? You know, often people think only in terms of government. I've got to lobby the government. It's the government that changes things. Well, it isn't. I mean, it is, but it's also Parliament. It's also the body, the dynamic as a whole. It is very dynamic. It's changing. It's looking at public opinion. It's shifting back and forth and sideways. And so figuring out what that core group is, it might be the parliamentary secretaries to particular ministers who are involved with the issue that you're working on. It might be the critics from the opposition parties. It might be the MPs who happen to be on the committee that relates to the issue where your issue is. So in this case, it would be the Foreign Affairs Committee. So that immediately shrinks it down to a much more manageable number. Or both, it might also be MPs who match to where you live. So if the United Network, if you guys decided that there are 30 of you who felt like you could take on lobbying and you wanted to organize it, you might match it to where you live, right? So you've got it across the country. Then you don't even have to come to Ottawa. You could even do it in your own riding. But the key thing is to do it systematically with the same questions, the same ask, and you have to debrief. So this is where lobbying starts falling apart, when people don't do that. They get a bunch of material, kind of dump it on the person. Thank you very much. Boy, I went to Parliament Hill, or I met my MP for 20 minutes. Did that, great. Well, the lobbying is only getting your foot in the door. The lobbying is actually only the first step. the real goal of lobbying is to build the relationships. And if you remember, I said earlier that it's building, how do you break down the barriers? Building trust and genuine relationships. So it's getting inside by developing those relationships one by one, and then figuring out what it is you can do with that. Because then you can go back. And I was saying to Mariana that when you go to lobby an MP, or say, let's say you come up with 30 or 50, whatever you think is manageable, and you all have the same thing that you're putting forward, you want it to be something that is so reasonable that the person can't actually turn it down. That is the key. You don't go in and say, by the way, we want you to end the occupation, we want you to call on the government, and and you come up with your whole list. And they're going to go, oh yeah, okay, bye. But if you say something like, would you be willing to raise this in your caucus? You get a commitment. Would you be willing to write a letter to the minister? Would you be willing to talk to your party's critic? Right, so you lower the bar. You come up with something that is reasonable, that really is difficult for that person to turn down. And why are we doing that? We're doing that because we actually want to develop the relationship with them. I mean, it sounds kind of sneaky, doesn't it? But I mean, it's really, you're trying to build that trust. So instead of just loading it all up and throwing it all out there, you're saying, let's begin at the beginning. Let's begin where you feel comfortable, and let's move from there. And through that process, you begin to find out who the champions are from all parties. Who is it who actually is going to, kind of get out there and push the envelope for you? Who is going to raise it within their caucus? Who's going to give you information, right? The gathering of intelligence is gold, right? That's what you want. How do you find out what's going on the inside? Well, you find it out from the people who are there. And if they trust you, they'll tell you if you don't break their confidence. So I hope that sort of gives you a bit of a sense of how it works. That's one engagement. The campaigns for sure. Building your movement for sure. Lobbying. I really love you guys to think about how you might do that, even with other organizations like IJV, like CJPME. Like, can you do it together?
Yeah.
Oh, one other way to do it. There still is a parliamentary association on Canada-Palestine, the Canada-Palestine Friendship Association. I was one of the members of it. I was the co-chair. The association, there is some good news. The association actually did go to the West Bank and Israel in 2018, so just a little more than a year ago. 18 MPs.
Yeah.
This is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Now, CJA sends trips multiple times a year. I don't know if you know this, they even send staff. They figure out who key staff are in each party, they send staff. It's a whole other level of operation, very sophisticated. But the fact that the Parliamentary Association, they work with the Palestinian Authority in Ottawa, who helped them, and others. But the fact that 18 of them went, I thought was just really great. And it was from all parties.
Yeah.
Very, very important. I myself went twice, 2002 and 2009. I was one of 2 MPs that actually got into Gaza. We had no help whatsoever from Foreign Affairs, it was called at the time. In fact, they said, if you get into trouble, we will disown you, we will not help you.
Oh,
And in fact, we did not go through Israel or Jordan, we went through Egypt, the Rafah crossing.
Yeah.
And we had to drive all the way through the Sinai Peninsula and
Oh my
up
God.
that way, standing, I mean, we never knew whether we were going to get in. We did, and we were hosted by UNRWA, and but the Canadian government was absolutely no help. And like others of you have said, for me it was a life-changing experience, both in 2002 and 2009. I will never forget the people I met and what we were told. And I felt a huge obligation and responsibility when I came back to continue the work, to raise it in the Canadian Parliament. And